Hello and welcome to Maximum Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, the first talking book about the artists. It was written and researched by Tim Footman and it's read by Sian Jones. You can check out our full catalogue on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk.
No, not at all. The beach inspired us to make music. The ocean. Yeah, the ocean.
The music of the Beach Boys still leaps out from the surrounding sonic fog more than 40 years after it first began. Trebly guitars, urgent rhythms and lush, yearning vocal harmonies are the hallmarks. The subject matter, surfing, girls, fast cars, seems to sum up an earlier, more innocent existence, when the sun always shone and the only thing to worry about was whether tomorrow's waves would be as big as today's. The big early hits, California Girls, Fun, 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 Help Me Rhonda, Surfin USA, still sprinkle their sunny magnificence on radio stations and soundtracks around the world. But these songs alone don't really explain why the Beach Boys are so important, or why their founder and on-off leader, Brian Wilson, is revered as one of the supreme architects of American popular music. Brian was one of the first songwriters in the rock era to look beneath the extrovert machismo of the genre, and write from the perspective of someone who was lonely, nervous and insecure. His own precarious mental state, coupled with his extraordinary musical imagination and instincts, allowed him to straddle two camps. He can be placed alongside the great songwriters such as Burt Bacharach, Lennon and McCartney or Smokey Robinson, and at the same time he's up there with the legendary basket cases of rock and roll, the people whose fame rests as much on their shaky grasp of reality as on their genius. Some of the oddities Brian created in the second half of the 1960s stand alongside the crazed artefacts of Syd Barrett, Arthur Lee and Captain Beefheart. His fragility and sensitivity make him an icon to dozens of indie and alternative musicians to this day. So what does it take to combine mainstream commercial success with off-kilter cult appeal? To find out, we need to catch a wave to the place that Brian immortalised as California.
My right ear is gone. Yeah, I'm deaf in my right ear. No, it didn't hurt. I still made pet sound, produced that real good, so yes.
Los Angeles is one of those cities with no centre and no definable boundary, so it's difficult to say with certainty where it actually begins and ends. Although Hawthorne calls itself a city, most people would define it as a southwestern suburb of the sprawling LA metropolis. For many years it's been an unexceptional middle-class area, home to many modestly successful businessmen like Murray Gage Wilson. Murray was born in Kansas in 1917, but moved to California with his family 5 years later. He made a comfortable living working for various manufacturing companies, and in 1950 he started his own heavy machinery company. Despite this conventional, boring exterior, however, Murray had a secret dream. He wanted to be a successful songwriter. But such creative urges, unfortunately, had to take a back seat to his responsibilities as a businessman who could provide for his wife Audrey and his 3 sons, Brian, Dennis and Carl. The boys seemed to be as conventional as their dad, preferring sports to study and eventually graduating to an interest in girls and cars. Brian, however, seemed to have inherited his father's musical leanings. In Christmas 1953, Murray's sister, Glee Love, organised a family concert based around her brother's music. But most people agreed that the high spot was young Brian singing a song written by his cousin and Glee's son, Michael Love. At first, Murray was delighted to encourage his son's interest in music. He bought Brian a tape recorder which allowed him to experiment with sound techniques, especially multi-part vocal harmonies. His main influence at the time was the spate of clean-cut vocal quartets that were popular throughout the USA, such as the 4 Freshmen and the 4 Preps. He was also fascinated by the raucous guitar rock coming from performers like Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly and, above all, Chuck Berry. Little brother Carl, meanwhile, was taking guitar lessons, although middle sibling Dennis was more interested in the girls. Brian was keen to put together a group, and his cousin Mike Love took no persuading to join. Carl was more nervous, so Brian appealed to his ego by naming the band Carl and the Passions. On the surface, it was just another high school group, good for a few parties but doomed to fizzle out. Brian, however, had other ideas, and just as importantly, so did Murray. Frustrated at his lack of success in the music world, it soon became obvious that Murray was looking for some kind of vicarious satisfaction through his eldest son. Wilson Sr. was a strict disciplinarian, exasperated when his son showed any kind of failure in academics, sports, or extracurricular activities. He was particularly exasperated when Brian achieved an F for a high school music project. The sonata he was supposed to write became an odd staccato melody that seemed to owe as much to rock and roll as it did to Beethoven. Murray's frustration could sometimes manifest itself in explosions of violence, including one incident when he punched Brian so hard that the boy became deaf in his right ear. One of Murray's friends was Height Morgan, who ran his own music publishing company. In the summer of 1961, Brian was invited to audition for them, and for support he pulled in members of his friends and family. Carl and Mike were there, of course, as was Dennis, who'd expressed a half-hearted interest in playing drums, and a friend of Brian's from the high school football team, folk music fan Alan Jardine. Possibly under Al Jardine's influence, the unnamed group performed two traditional tunes, Rio Grande and Sloop John B. Morgan was impressed by their harmonies, but said he needed original material. Dennis spontaneously came up with the invention that Brian and Mike had written a song about his own favourite pastime, surfing. When Morgan expressed an interest, the cousins were then put on the spot. They went back to the Wilsons' house and hastily wrote a song.
I think Phil Spector is God. I think he is.
Surfing was a creation of the inhabitants of Pacific islands such as Hawaii and Tahiti, but in the 1950s and 60s it became increasingly popular with the newly affluent teenagers of post-war America, especially in Southern California. It seemed to symbolise the freedom and optimism of the economic boom years, overseen by the avuncular President Eisenhower and his successor, the dynamic John F. Kennedy. Although Brian Wilson and Mike Love both enjoyed the beach lifestyle, neither of them had actually set foot on a surfboard. Neither had Carl or Al. Only Dennis was a surfer, and for him it was chiefly a means of picking up girls. But it was Dennis's older brother and cousin who found themselves with the task of throwing together a surfing song. Brian reworked the tune that had earned him the F as a school project, and Mike came up with some simple lyrics accentuated by a nagging nonsense refrain that went bom bom dip de dit. The song was entitled with some inevitability, Surfin. Murray and Audrey had left town for the Labour Day weekend, leaving Brian with $300 for food and emergencies. Instead, he used the cash to rent instruments, and the quintet spent the weekend practising the new tune. When Murray returned, instead of erupting at his son's insubordination, he announced that he was their new manager. Under his guidance, Brian and Mike signed a songwriting contract with Guild Music. The band, at that point using the name The Pendletones after a popular brand of shirt, recorded Surfin and two other tracks at the Morgan Studios. In November, Surfin was released as a single on the Candix label, although the band's name had been changed without the knowledge of any of the members. The five fresh-faced youngsters were now officially the Beach Boys. Surfin didn't exactly set the music world on fire, but it picked up quite a lot of airplay in and around the band's Southern California homeland. In early 1962 it reached the Billboard Hot 100, peaking at number 75. By this stage, life was changing fast for the band. First, Al Jardine resigned in order to go to college and was replaced by David Marks. Then, after Murray Wilson had tried without success to convince the major record companies of the Beach Boys' worth, an A&R man at Capitol Records decided to take a risk. The Beach Boys' debut single on Capitol was Surfin' Safari, which made it to number 14 on the US charts. Although it was still a cheerfully anodyne tale of girls and waves, Surfin' Safari was a massive leap forward for the band. Its harmonies were more complex, and Mike Love's lyrics wittily summed up the surf culture universe, from Hawaii to the shores of Peru. The single's early success was enough to persuade Capitol to release an album called inevitably Surfin' Safari. Quality control clearly wasn't top of the agenda, and some of the tracks aren't even good enough to be described as filler, especially Chug a Lug about drinking root beer and a downright abysmal cover version of Eddie Cochran's Summertime Blues. Still, it was good enough to keep the band's profile up and even reach the top 40. At this point in the early 1960s, the Beach Boys were just one band riding on the back of the California surf music craze. Most people in the business thought it was just going to be a short-lived trend, so there was an intense pressure to squeeze as much life out of contracted acts. The Beach Boys' second album, Surfin' USA, was put out less than 6 months after their debut, and Capitol would release 2 more before the end of 1963. At the same time, Brian was producing a girl band called The Honeys, featuring his girlfriend Marilyn Ravel, and writing songs for Jan and Dean. In fact, the duo's Wilson-penned hit Surf City would reach number 1 in August 1963, before any Beach Boys tune had hit the top spot. Brian's abilities as a songwriter were becoming increasingly evident. The boisterous songs celebrating the surf lifestyle were now mixed up with gentle love songs such as Surfer Girl and the melancholy introspective In My Room. This creative development was partly explained by a respectful rivalry with a young producer named Phil Spector, whose Wall of Sound productions had a similar mixture of exuberance and anguish to the Beach Boys' better songs. Then, in early 1964, all of America became aware of a band from Liverpool, whose infectious tunes and thrilling harmonies were unlike anything heard in pop music before. As the world took the Beatles to its collective heart, Brian Wilson knew the race was really on.